The vanishing hotel room. You've probably heard those urban legends about cursed hotels, right? The ones where rooms are haunted, or strange guests disappear without a trace? I always thought those stories were made up to scare people. But after what happened to me in 2017, I know better. I was driving through Arizona, on my way to a client meeting in Phoenix. It was late, and I'd been on the road for hours. Exhausted, I decided to stop for the night at a small roadside motel called Desert Haven Inn. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the parking lot was almost empty. I figured it wasn't much, but it was better than falling asleep behind the wheel. The lobby smelled like stale coffee and cleaning supplies. The woman at the front desk was older, with a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Room for the night?" she asked. "Yeah. Just one." She handed me a key attached to an old-fashioned brass keychain with the number 6 engraved on it. "Checkout's at 10, she said, her voice monotone. Room 6 was at the far end of the motel. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room was basic, a queen-sized bed, a tiny TV, and an old AC unit humming in the corner. I tossed my bag on the chair and collapsed onto the bed without even bothering to change. The mattress was lumpy, and the sheets smelled faintly of bleach, but I was too tired to care. At some point during the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint, like a soft tapping coming from inside the walls. I sat up, heart pounding. "Probably just pipes," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains. I felt uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. The tapping had stopped, but something about the room felt off. I grabbed my things and headed to the lobby to check out. The front desk was empty. "Hello?" I called out, but no one answered. Annoyed, I left the key on the counter and stepped outside. That's when I froze. The parking lot was empty. Not just empty, abandoned. The asphalt was cracked, weeds growing through the splits. The neon sign I'd seen the night before was shattered, its letters hanging loose. I turned to look at the motel, and my stomach dropped. The building was in ruins. Windows were shattered, doors hung off their hinges, and the walls were covered in graffiti. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I walked back to room 6, my heart racing. The door was gone, replaced by a jagged hole in the wall. Inside, the bed was overturned, the furniture smashed. Dust coated everything, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. My bag was gone, along with everything I'd brought with me. Panic set in as I stumbled out of the room. "This can't be real," I muttered, gripping my phone. I dialed Jesse, my co-worker. No signal, the phone chirped. I tried calling 911. Nothing. As I stood there, trembling, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A man was sitting on the edge of the parking lot, his back to me. He wore a tattered suit, and his head hung low. "Hey!" I called, running toward him. "What's going on here?" He didn't respond. As I got closer, I noticed his skin was pale, almost gray, and his hands were shaking. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The second my fingers brushed his jacket, he turned. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. But it was his mouth that terrified me, it was sewn shut with thick, black thread. I stumbled back, tripping over my feet. The man stared at me, his hollow eyes filled with something that looked like pity. And then he whispered. At least, I think he did. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice, faint and desperate, in my head, "You need to leave. Before it takes you to." I ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I went, the motel was always in front of me. The same broken sign, the same cracked parking lot. It didn't make sense. I tried cutting through the desert, but after hours of walking, I found myself back at room 6. The whispers started again, faint at first, then louder. I heard my name, repeated over and over. "Nate, Nate, Nate." The voice was coming from inside the room. Against my better judgment, I stepped through the ruined doorway. The room was darker than before, the shadows deeper, almost alive. In the center of the floor was my bag, perfectly intact. I approached it cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming to leave. As I reached for the bag, the whispers turned into screams. The walls began to pulse, the paint peeling away to reveal something writhing beneath the surface, faces. Dozens of them, their mouths open in silent screams. The man with the sewn mouth appeared in the corner, his eyes wide with fear. "It's coming," his voice echoed in my mind. The temperature dropped, my breath visible in the icy air. And then I saw it, a towering figure emerging from the shadows. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting, but its eyes burned like hot coals. "Why are you here?" it growled, its voice reverberating through the room. I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing away. It reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against my chest. Pain shot through me, and I fell to my knees. "This is my domain," it hissed. "All who enter belong to me." Desperate, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. The entity roared, the sound shaking the building. As I crossed the threshold, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the side of the highway, my car parked a few feet away. The motel was gone. I checked my phone, it was 8 a.m. on the same day I'd checked in. My bag was in the passenger seat, but everything inside was soaked, as if it had been submerged in water. I drove straight to Phoenix, trying to convince myself it was a hallucination, a bad dream. But that night, when I opened my suitcase, I found a single item I hadn't packed, the brass key to room 6. So if you're ever driving through the Arizona desert and see a motel called Desert Haven Inn, keep driving. Because once you check in, you might never check out. The Forgotten Tunnel. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot echoed through the dense forest as the group of 5 college friends made their way to the infamous abandoned train tunnel. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and the promise of rain. Above them, skeletal branches of ancient trees intertwined, creating a natural canopy that blocked out the fading evening light. "I still think this is a bad idea," Sarah muttered, hugging her jacket tightly around her. Her auburn hair glinted faintly in the dim light of the setting sun. "Come on, Sarah," Jake replied, a wide grin spreading across his face. His flashlight beam danced along the overgrown trail ahead. "It's just a stupid dare. We go in, take a selfie, and come out. Easy." "Yeah," chimed in Emily, her best friend, rolling her eyes. "Don't be such a buzzkill. It's not like the tunnel's haunted or anything. It's just old." Mark, the quiet one of the group, said nothing. His camera hung around his neck, and he occasionally stopped to snap photos of the eerie scenery. Meanwhile, Dan, the self-proclaimed jokester of the group, lagged behind, kicking a stray rock down the path. As they neared the entrance to the tunnel, a wave of unease washed over Sarah. The structure was massive, its stone archway looming like the gaping maw of some ancient beast. Thick vines crept along its surface, and rusted iron rails disappeared into the black abyss. "This place gives me the creeps," she said, her voice barely audible. "Exactly why we're here," Dan said with a laugh, throwing an arm around her shoulders. "Lighten up, Sarah. Live a little." The group stood at the entrance, their flashlights cutting feeble beams into the inky darkness. A cold breeze emanated from within, carrying a faint metallic scent. It was unnervingly silent, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the steady drip of water somewhere deep inside. "All right," Jake announced, pulling out his phone. "Let's make it quick. In and out. 10 minutes." They stepped inside, their footsteps reverberating off the damp stone walls. The temperature dropped sharply, and Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. The air was heavy, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. "This place is ancient," Mark said, his voice tinged with awe. He snapped a photo of the moss-covered walls, his flash briefly illuminating strange markings carved into the stone. "What are those?" Emily asked, stepping closer to inspect the symbols. They were intricate, almost runic, but unlike anything she'd ever seen before. "Maybe graffiti?" Jake suggested, though he sounded unsure. "Let's keep moving." As they ventured deeper, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the light from the entrance fading until it was nothing more than a distant pinprick. The markings grew more frequent, interspersed with what appeared to be crude drawings of figures, humanoid, but distorted. The group fell silent, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the occasional drip of water. Every now and then, Sarah thought she heard something, a faint whisper, just on the edge of perception. But when she turned, there was nothing but shadows. "Guys, look at this," Mark called out, his voice echoing. He was crouched near the wall, examining a pile of objects half buried in the dirt. The others gathered around, their flashlights converging on the spot. There were rusted coins, broken glass bottles, and what looked like fragments of old photographs. But it was the doll that caught Sarah's attention. It was small, its porcelain face cracked, with one eye missing. Its faded dress was smeared with what she hoped was mud. "That's creepy," Emily said, stepping back. "It's just junk," Dan scoffed, kicking at the pile. But as his foot connected with the doll, a low, guttural growl echoed through the tunnel. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "Probably an animal," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep moving." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The growl had sounded almost human. As they continued, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional nervous laugh. Then, without warning, the flashlight beams flickered. "Great," Dan muttered, smacking his flashlight. "Cheap batteries." "Shh," Mark hissed, holding up a hand. "Did you hear that?" The group froze, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing. Then it came again, a faint, wet sound, like something being dragged across the ground. "All right, that's it," Sarah said, turning to leave. "I'm done. Let's go back." But as she turned, she realized with growing horror that Dan was gone. "Dan?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny." They shone their flashlights around, the beam slicing through the darkness. There was no sign of him. "Dan!" Jake shouted, his voice echoing. The dragging sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural chuckle that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Run," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now!" Panic set in as the group sprinted back the way they came. But no matter how far they ran, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly. The markings on the walls grew more intricate, almost pulsating in the dim light. "We should have reached the entrance by now," Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's a straight tunnel," Jake shouted back. "This doesn't make any sense." The chuckle came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. "Keep moving," Mark yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her forward. But then Emily screamed. Sarah turned just in time to see her friend being dragged into the shadows, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The scream cut off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Emily!" Jake shouted, running toward the spot where she disappeared. "Don't!" Sarah cried, but it was too late. As Jake reached the edge of the shadows, something lashed out, a black, writhing tendril that wrapped around his ankle and yanked him into the darkness. Now it was just Sarah and Mark. They clung to each other, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The markings on the walls seemed to glow faintly, casting an eerie light that only deepened the shadows. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mark didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something ahead, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was tall, its body obscured by the shadows, but its eyes burned like hot coals. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice deep and resonant, like the rumble of an approaching storm. "We're sorry," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "We didn't mean to." "Leave," the figure interrupted. "If you can." Without another word, it vanished, leaving the two in stunned silence. They didn't wait for an explanation. Gripping each other's hands, they ran. This time, the tunnel seemed to shift, the walls narrowing and the floor slanting upward. Finally, they saw it, the faint glow of the entrance. With a final burst of energy, they sprinted toward the light, bursting out into the cool night air. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. Days later, the authorities searched the tunnel but found no trace of their friends. The markings, the artifacts, everything was gone, as if the tunnel had swallowed it whole. Sarah and Mark never spoke of what happened that night. But sometimes, in the dead of night, Sarah swore she could hear it, that low, guttural chuckle, echoing from the shadows. The Midnight Call. It was a chilly autumn evening in suburban Oregon. Amber Hayes sat curled up on her worn-out leather couch, a mug of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. The house was eerily silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. It was 11:55 p.m., and the exhaustion of the day was beginning to take its toll. She reached for the remote to turn off the television when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Frowning, she picked it up. An unknown number was flashing on the screen. "Who calls at this hour?" she muttered. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. "Hello? Amber?" a raspy voice whispered. She felt a chill run down her spine. The voice sounded familiar but off, like someone trying to disguise their true tone. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "Amber," Listen carefully, the voice rasped. You're in danger. Lock your doors. Her heart raced. What kind of sick joke is this? Who are you? The line went dead. Amber stared at her phone, her breath shallow. She shook her head, dismissing it as a prank. But as she rose to lock the door,
next night
she noticed her hands trembling.
Her phone rang again.
Amber hesitated before picking up. Amber, the same voice whispered, you didn't believe me, did you? Her throat tightened. Who are you? What do you want? I'm trying to protect you, the voice said. But you need to listen to me. Tonight, at 12:15, you'll hear footsteps outside your window. Don't look. The call ended abruptly. Amber's stomach churned with unease. She stared at the clock, 11:59 p.m. She wanted to laugh it off as a prank but couldn't shake the ominous feeling creeping over her. 12:15 a.m. arrived, and just as the caller predicted, faint footsteps echoed outside her bedroom window. Her body froze. Don't look. The words rang in her head. But curiosity clawed at her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. Nothing. Just the darkness of her backyard. A relieved sigh escaped her lips, but it was short-lived. A sharp knock on the window made her jump. She bolted out of bed, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911. By the time the police arrived, the backyard was empty. No footprints. No sign of anyone lurking. Ma'am, it's probably just a prank, the officer said, though his tone lacked conviction. Amber nodded, though her unease deepened. The midnight calls continued for a week. Each time, the caller shared intimate details about Amber's life, her childhood fears, her failed engagement, the scar on her left knee from a bike accident. Stop calling me. She screamed one night. I can't, the voice replied. You need me. And I need you. What does that even mean? She snapped, tears streaming down her face. But the line went dead, as always. Desperate for answers, Amber began digging. She visited the phone company, hoping to trace the number. But every attempt hit a dead end. The calls weren't coming from a registered line. That's when she decided to record the conversations. On the 8th night, the caller whispered, Amber, tomorrow you'll see me. See you? Where? She asked, her voice shaking. Look in the mirror. At midnight. The call ended, leaving her trembling. The next night, Amber stood in front of her bathroom mirror as the clock struck midnight. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She stared at her reflection, waiting. And then, it happened. The mirror fogged over as if someone had breathed on it. Words began to appear, written by an invisible hand. I'm sorry. Amber stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of lotion. Who are you? She whispered. The mirror cleared, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, her reflection changed. The figure staring back at her wasn't her. It was a woman, pale, with hollow eyes and a long gash across her throat. Amber screamed and bolted out of the bathroom. The next day, Amber confided in her best friend, Claire. You're being haunted, Claire said, half joking but clearly unnerved. I don't believe in ghosts, Amber replied, though her voice wavered. You might have to start, Claire said. That night, the caller revealed the truth. Amber, the voice rasped, my name is Evelyn. I used to live in your house. Amber froze. What do you mean? I was murdered. 10 years ago. In your bedroom. No, Amber whispered, her knees buckling. You have to help me, Evelyn pleaded. He's still out there. And he's coming for you. Who? Amber asked, panic seeping into her voice. The man who killed me. Amber spent the next day at the library, researching her home's history. What she found left her shaken. 10 years ago, a woman named Evelyn Marks was found dead in the house, a victim of a brutal murder. The case remained unsolved. Amber's mind raced. Was this really happening? Or was she losing her grip on reality? That night, Evelyn called again. He's close, she whispered. You have to run. Amber grabbed her keys and bolted to her car. But as she pulled out of the driveway, her headlights illuminated a man standing in the shadows. He wore a black hoodie, and his face was obscured. Amber's blood ran cold. The man followed her. She could see his car in her rearview mirror, the headlights glaring. Evelyn, what do I do? She cried into her phone. Go to the police station, Evelyn's voice urged. Amber sped through the streets, her hands trembling on the wheel. When she finally reached the police station, the car following her vanished. Inside, she told the officers everything, about the calls, the warnings, the man. To her relief, they took her seriously. The next day, the police apprehended a suspect, a man with a criminal record who had been lurking around Amber's neighborhood. He matched the description of Evelyn's killer from old witness reports. Amber received one final call that night. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered. "You've set me free." The line went dead, and the calls never came again. Amber moved out of the house shortly after, but the experience stayed with her. She began volunteering at a local women's shelter, hoping to honor Evelyn's memory by helping others in danger. And every time the clock struck midnight, she couldn't help but glance at her phone, half expecting it to ring.